The stench of burning flesh and smoldering rubble hung heavy in the air as dawn broke over the Pacific Islands. The sun, struggling to break through the smoke and haze of battle, cast an eerie glow over a scene of devastation. Below the ridgelines, amidst the jungle and the carnage, the cries of the wounded and the thunder of artillery fire mixed into a symphony of chaos. The Second World War had turned this once peaceful stretch of land into a hellish battleground. And for many, it was the last battlefield they would ever see. For women caught up in the war, the terror of battle took on a different form. They were not soldiers in the sense that men were. Instead, they were mothers, daughters, and wives caught in the web of a war they had never asked for. In the crucible of war, however, gender roles were often blurred. Women, like their male counterparts, were taken as prisoners of war, subjected to the horrors of captivity, and forced to endure unimaginable suffering. Yet in the darkest corners of this global conflict, a flicker of humanity would soon shine, one that would astonish and empower those who had never been given the chance to experience it before. It was in the internment camps of the Pacific War that Japanese women, held as prisoners of the Americans, would find something that neither they nor their captors had expected: a network of hospitals exclusively staffed by women. As the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months, those same women who had once been brutalized and dehumanized by their captors began to witness an extraordinary shift. The very thing they had feared and dreaded, the brutality of war, was softened by an unlikely force: the kindness, professionalism, and compassion of American women. For the Japanese women prisoners, the first encounter with the women-only hospitals would be nothing short of awe-inspiring. What was it that had transformed the nature of captivity from an unrelenting struggle to an experience that, while still harrowing, offered some semblance of hope? This was the moment when the war took a surprising turn, one that would leave an indelible mark on the minds of those who lived through it. They had entered the war with preconceived notions of power, dominance, and the role of women in the military, but what they would soon discover would challenge every stereotype they had held. The women who ran these hospitals were not merely survivors of war, they were trailblazers. They had fought their own battles to enter the medical field, overcoming societal prejudices and professional barriers. When they were called upon during the war, they did not simply perform their duties, they transformed the lives of those in their care. The Japanese women prisoners, initially skeptical and fearful, began to recognize the sincerity in the actions of their captors, especially the women in charge of their medical treatment. The hospitals where these women worked were unlike any others the Japanese prisoners had encountered. These were not places of neglect or indifference, but rather institutions of healing and understanding. In the face of the brutality of war, these hospitals stood as beacons of hope and compassion, demonstrating that even in the most desperate circumstances, humanity could still prevail. What would unfold in the following months would be nothing short of a cultural exchange between women on opposite sides of a war, a meeting of minds and hearts that would leave an indelible impression on both groups. As the Japanese women were treated by their American counterparts, something shifted. The walls of fear and mistrust built over years of warfare slowly began to crumble. The prisoners, who had once viewed their captors with suspicion and animosity, now saw them in a new light. These women, who had been assigned to the most grueling and dangerous tasks, were showing them a side of life they had never imagined, one where women were not subjugated, but empowered. In the face of war, it was the strength and compassion of these women that would become a defining aspect of the prisoners' time in captivity. The Japanese women POWs, who had once been demoralized by the horrors of war, now found themselves awed and inspired by the very women who had once been their enemies. This, then, is the heart of the story, the unspoken bond between women in the most extraordinary of circumstances during one of history's most brutal conflicts. It is a tale of courage, resilience, and the surprising ways in which war can change lives, and for some it would be a transformation that would resonate for the rest of their lives. The year was 1942. The world was entrenched in the throes of the Second World War. Across the Pacific, the tide of battle had been relentlessly pushing forward, from the shocking attack on Pearl Harbor to the harrowing campaign that would engulf entire nations. For the Japanese Empire, the war was a campaign of territorial expansion, seeking to assert dominance over the vast expanse of the Pacific and East Asia. But the war would soon come at a heavy cost. both militarily and morally, as the world witnessed acts of aggression, brutality, and inhumanity. Among those most affected by the carnage were the civilian populations, who became pawns in a conflict far beyond their control. For the women of Japan, the war presented a unique set of challenges. While many men were sent to the front lines fighting on land, sea, and air, women were often tasked with supporting the war effort from home. But as the conflict expanded, the role of women in the military became more pronounced. Japan, like many other nations, sought to leverage the resources and labor of its women, urging them to take on roles traditionally held by men. It was during this period that the Imperial Japanese Army, alongside the Navy, started recruiting women for various roles, including nurses, medical auxiliaries, and administrators in the military. As the war escalated, so did the number of women who found themselves on the front lines of conflict, not as soldiers but as casualties of the war. With the collapse of the Japanese defenses in the Pacific, many Japanese soldiers, their families, and their female auxiliaries became prisoners of war, detained in camps that stretched across the globe, from the Philippines to the islands of the Pacific. The conditions were harsh, the treatment cruel, and the moral strain was unbearable. For these women, captured during the brutal invasions and military setbacks, life as a prisoner was not only a matter of survival, but of enduring the psychological torment of captivity. The men in the Japanese military, who had long held a dominant position in society, were now at the mercy of their captors. But the women prisoners faced a different set of challenges. With their femininity and vulnerability, they were subjected to additional humiliation. Women POWs, many of whom were medical personnel or civilians, endured physical and sexual abuse, all while struggling to maintain their dignity amidst their internment. Meanwhile, across the Pacific, the United States had emerged as one of the world's most powerful military forces, bringing not only men but also a considerable number of women into the fold of war. While women in the U.S. were often relegated to administrative and auxiliary roles, a significant number took on highly skilled positions as nurses, doctors, and medical professionals. The war created an environment in which women's contributions were no longer dismissed. Instead, they were essential to the success of the war effort. From the onset, the United States military had a distinct advantage when it came to the medical care of its troops. However, as the war expanded, the U.S. began to realize that treating prisoners of war, especially those who were captured under brutal circumstances, required a shift in strategy. There were many prisoners, many of whom were women who had suffered not just from the physical wounds of battle, but from the deep psychological trauma that came with captivity. The U.S. began to assemble specialized teams that would help care for these prisoners, and these medical teams would also include women who had been trained in military medicine and hospital administration. The United States government and military understood that treating prisoners of war, particularly those who had been subjected to brutality by the Japanese, would require more than just medical expertise. It would require empathy and an understanding of the human condition. These hospitals, staffed primarily by women, would not only tend to physical wounds, but they would also offer a sanctuary for the victims of war, a rare moment of peace amidst the brutality. These women were not simply following orders. They were redefining the nature of war itself. They were women in a world where men had traditionally dominated, and now they were showing their captors a different way. The hospitals they managed were places of healing, where dignity was preserved and lives were saved even amidst the devastation. In stark contrast to the relentless violence of the battlefield, the hospitals represented a glimmer of hope for both American and Japanese women, trapped in a war that had no clear end in sight. The prisoners, including the Japanese women, began to witness firsthand the level of care they had never before received. In their time of need, these women were given a voice, a chance to experience what it was like to be treated with respect, as equals, in the harshest of circumstances. The Japanese women POWs were in awe of what they saw. It was not just the medical care. They were taken aback by the way the American women treated them, the gentleness with which they handled their injuries, and the way they listened to them. There was no hatred in the eyes of these American women. Instead, there was compassion, which was a stark contrast to the unforgiving nature of war that had marked their lives. The women POWs were stunned by the realization that, despite the brutal and hostile environment they found themselves in, there was still humanity to be found. even on the other side of the enemy line. For many of them, this encounter would change their perception of the war, of women, and of the broader world around them. What had begun as a story of oppression and fear would evolve into a story of compassion, resilience, and transformation. This human connection, born out of suffering and struggle, would soon prove to be one of the most unexpected yet powerful results of the Second World War. A connection that would transcend national borders, politics, and the horrors of battle itself. As the war dragged on, the nature of captivity began to shift in unexpected ways. For those prisoners held by the United States, the harsh realities of war were tempered by the presence of these extraordinary women. The women-only hospitals that began to appear throughout the Pacific became symbols of hope for the Japanese POWs, who had previously known nothing but brutality. The sight of American women, some of whom had fought their own battles to gain a place in the military, working tirelessly to provide care to their captives, was not just a form of treatment, it was a silent, unspoken revolution. These women, who had faced prejudice and gender bias in their own country, were now in charge of saving lives on a scale they had never imagined. The hospitals they oversaw were not merely places where the sick and wounded were patched up. They were sanctuaries where human dignity was preserved. In a war that had seen so many lives lost, these women were dedicated to ensuring that their captives, regardless of nationality, had the opportunity to survive, to heal, and perhaps even to change. For the Japanese women prisoners, the experience was transformative. At first, many of them had viewed the American women with suspicion, seeing them only as enemies. But as the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months, they began to see that there was a profound difference between the American women and their male counterparts. These women, despite being enemies, treated them with respect, empathy, and a level of care they had not known was possible. The emotional impact was immense. For the first time, these prisoners saw women in power in a way that contradicted everything they had been taught. Japanese society had long been steeped in patriarchal traditions, where women were expected to adhere to strict roles. To see American women taking charge, to see them leading medical teams, making decisions, and providing care was a revelation. The concept of female power and autonomy was no longer something foreign. It was right before their eyes. These women had risen above the horrors of the war, and in doing so, they had found a way to give back to those who had been their enemies. But the personal stories of the POWs also painted a more intimate picture of what these hospitals represented. Many of the Japanese women POWs had come from positions of power within their own society. Some had been nurses, administrators, and auxiliaries, roles that in their home country had given them a certain amount of authority and respect. But once captured, they were stripped of these roles, reduced to mere prisoners, subject to the whims of their captors. In the hospitals, they found a new sense of purpose. For some, it was a return to their former roles as medical professionals. For others, it was a painful reminder of how far they had fallen. But regardless of the personal losses, the hospitals gave them something far more significant: a chance to experience a measure of dignity and respect, even in the depths of their captivity. On the other side, the American women working in these hospitals were fighting their own battles. Theirs was not a battle against a foreign enemy, but against the societal expectations that had once told them their place was in the home, not on the front lines. The war had changed all of that. It had opened doors for women, allowing them to step into roles traditionally held by men. Now, as the war reached its darkest moments, they were not just caretakers, they were leaders. They made decisions that impacted not only the lives of their fellow soldiers, but also those of their enemies. As the women POWs began to heal, physically and emotionally, they started to realize that their treatment was not just about medical care. The kindness they received was a form of resistance, a refusal to give in to the dehumanizing forces of war. It was an act of defiance against the very nature of the conflict they were caught up in. It was a declaration that even in the darkest moments, humanity could still shine through. One of the most remarkable aspects of this shift was the mutual respect that slowly developed between the Japanese women and their American counterparts. It was not a bond forged out of shared ideology or national loyalty. Rather, it was a bond based on shared humanity. They had all suffered in different ways, but now they were learning from each other. The prisoners, who had once been reduced to mere objects of war, were now finding a new sense of self-worth, not just as survivors, but as women who had endured the unimaginable. The American women, on the other hand, had their own lessons to learn. They too had been shaped by the war, but their involvement in these hospitals gave them a new perspective on what it meant to serve. They saw the consequences of war firsthand, not just in terms of military strategy, but in the faces of the women before them, who had been caught in the crossfire of a conflict that had nothing to do with them. In caring for these prisoners, they found a new sense of purpose, one that transcended the battlefield. Their commitment to healing became their own form of resistance, resisting the idea that war could strip away all human decency. As the war came to its conclusion, both sides began to take stock of the events that had transpired. The significance of the women-only hospitals would not be lost on history. What had begun as an unforeseen outcome of war, the compassionate care of women for women, had evolved into a movement that would change how future generations viewed the role of women in conflict. The impact of these hospitals would go far beyond the prisoners they treated. It would serve as a reminder that, even in the most trying of times, there were forces at work that could transcend the violence of war. The women of these hospitals had made history, not through military might but through empathy, professionalism, and an unwavering commitment to preserving the dignity of those in their care. Their story would not be one of tanks and bombs, but of compassion in the face of war's darkest hour. A story of women who showed the world what it meant to lead with grace and courage, even in the midst of destruction. The war that had torn the world apart, leaving scars across nations, continents, and individuals, was slowly drawing to its conclusion. The Allied forces, having emerged victorious, began to piece together the broken remnants of the globe, reconstructing what had been shattered by years of violence. Yet, in the quiet aftermath of conflict, one profound reality began to emerge. The Second World War had changed not only the political and economic landscape of the world, but the very nature of warfare itself, particularly when it came to the role of women. The story of the Japanese women POWs, who had been treated with an unexpected kindness and care by their American counterparts, was not just an isolated incident. It became emblematic of the broader shifts in the world, particularly in the military. What had once been an exclusively male domain was now being reshaped by the contributions of women, those who had not only stepped into roles of leadership and combat, but who had also redefined the very meaning of humanitarian action in times of war. In the immediate aftermath of the war, as both Japan and the United States began the process of rebuilding, the role of women in these societies took on new significance. For the American women who had served in the military, the hospitals they ran and the POWs they treated marked the culmination of their fight for equality. These women, who had once been excluded from many aspects of military life, had proven themselves on the front lines of war, not just as caregivers, but as leaders. Their efforts, though initially seen through the lens of necessity, became a symbol of the transformative power of women in war. For the Japanese women who had been captured and imprisoned, the experience of being cared for by their American counterparts had a profound impact on their own sense of identity and their role in post-war society. In the face of destruction, they had witnessed the strength and resilience of women who had not only survived, but had triumphed over the war's brutality. These women, often relegated to secondary roles in their own society, began to see new possibilities for themselves. The experience of compassion they received in the American hospitals, alongside the understanding that women could be both warriors and healers, reshaped their expectations of what it meant to be a woman in a post-war world. However, the most profound transformation came not through policy changes or political shifts, but through the stories and experiences that were passed down from one generation to the next. The women who had served in these hospitals, both American and Japanese, carried with them the indelible imprint of their wartime experiences. They had seen the worst that humanity had to offer, but they had also witnessed the best. The compassion they had shown one another in the darkest moments of the war was a reminder that, even in the face of unspeakable violence, there was still hope for humanity. As the decades passed and the world moved further away from the conflict, the memory of these women's contributions was often overshadowed by the more traditional narratives of war, the generals, the battles, the political deals. Yet for those who had lived through the war, the memory of the women-only hospitals and the healing that had taken place within them remained a cornerstone of their understanding of what it meant to be a woman in a world at war. These women had not just cared for their fellow soldiers or their enemies, they had cared for the very future of humanity. They had made it possible for others to heal, not just physically but emotionally, helping them find a path to recovery after years of brutality. The significance of these hospitals extended beyond the immediate context of the war. The lessons learned within their walls reverberated long after the guns fell silent. They became a testament to the power of empathy and human connection, even in times of the greatest conflict. For the American women who served as the caretakers of the POWs, it was not just a matter of fulfilling their duty. It was about standing as proof that women had a critical role to play in shaping the future, not only on the battlefield but in the realm of healing and reconciliation. Similarly, for the Japanese women who had been prisoners, the experience served as a powerful reminder that in the most trying of times, there could still be moments of grace and humanity. The American women who had cared for them demonstrated that, no matter the cruelty of war, kindness was always possible. This newfound understanding of female solidarity and mutual respect would influence the way these women would shape the post-war world, but the legacy of these women went far beyond their immediate roles as caregivers. As the post-war years unfolded, many of the women who had been involved in these hospitals would go on to become pioneers in their respective fields, breaking barriers in medicine, law, and education. The story of the Japanese women POWs and the American women who cared for them became part of a larger narrative, one that transcended national boundaries and political divides. It was a story of two groups of women, divided by war but united by their shared humanity, who transformed the very meaning of what it meant to be a woman in a world at war. As we reflect on this chapter of history, we are reminded that the true cost of war is not always measured in the number of soldiers lost or the land conquered. Sometimes it is measured in the quiet acts of courage, compassion, and humanity that take place far from the front lines, in the hospitals and camps where the real work of healing and rebuilding is done. It is in these moments that we see the true power of women, who, even in the darkest moments, have the ability to change the world. The legacy of these women lives on, not only in the history books but in the hearts and minds of those who understand that the most powerful victories in war are often won not through force or violence, but through empathy, understanding, and the willingness to care for those who have been torn apart by conflict. With the war behind them, the women of the Pacific would never forget the lessons they had learned. Their stories would continue to echo through the generations, a powerful reminder of the strength of the human spirit and the lasting impact of women in the shaping of a post-war world.